Part 1. Prologue. Different worlds. Imagine the world at the peak of the Cold War. Two superpowers, two poles. The USSR is building communism and promising to catch up and overtake America. Meanwhile, the United States is living through the Kennedy era, the struggle for civil rights, and Woodstock. We are used to comparing their rockets, their economies, and their ways of life. But today, we will look beyond, where the spotlight usually does not reach. We will compare how the two superpowers isolated their citizens from society, how they punished, how they corrected, and ultimately, what they believed in. A prison is always a mirror of society. And this is the story of how, in the 1960s and 70s, the USSR tried to forget the horrific past of the Gulag, while America took its first step toward its future catastrophe, the era of mass incarceration. This script was written not for a dry comparison, but so that you might live these 15 minutes inside two different yet equally crushing realities. Part 2. Point of reference. The Ghost of the Gulag versus the Great Society. By the early 1960s, the past was striking both countries with different force but equal pain. In the Soviet Union, the wound of the Gulag was still bleeding. Only 7 years had passed since Stalin's death. Millions of people who had been through the camps were returning to life. The official number of prisoners at the time of the leader's death was about 2.5 million people. It was an economy built on slave labor, an economy that, as it suddenly turned out, was absolutely unprofitable. And so, in 1960, the Gulag system officially ceased to exist. The Ministry of Internal Affairs transferred the camps to the jurisdiction of Republican bodies. The number of prisoners plummeted to 600,000. The Soviet leadership, headed by Khrushchev, acknowledged the obvious. Running the great construction projects of the century using convict labor was pointless. It was expensive and inefficient. It was cheaper to hire a free worker than to feed, guard, and bury a prisoner. In the USA, the picture was different. There was no Gulag here. The number of prisoners had remained stable for many years, approximately 100 to 110 people per 100,000 population. This was the era of so-called penal liberalism. Intellectuals said that prisons had outlived their usefulness. Rehabilitation centers were opening. It was believed that a criminal could be corrected like a broken mechanism. America was experiencing a surge in street crime, yet President Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty, not a war on crime. Money was invested in social programs, in youth, in education. Prison was seen as a last resort. Here, at the very beginning of the 1960s, the two systems seemed to be moving toward each other. The USSR is winding down its repressive machine, while the USA has not yet started its own. This is a brief moment of strange, penal convergence, a historical inflection point. Part 3. Walls and Codes. A show trial versus formal procedure. But behind the numbers were people. And the most crucial difference between the USSR and the USA lay not in the thickness of walls, but in legal philosophy. In the Soviet Union, the infamous Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, was still in force. A conversation in the kitchen or reading a banned book could land you 7 years in the camps, followed by 5 years of exile. There was also the notorious Article 190-1, dissemination of knowingly false fabrications defaming the Soviet system. Human rights activists, dissidents, their path led to prisons for political prisoners. The Mordovian camps, Vladimir prison, the Kresty in Leningrad. But there was one important detail that exposed the system's hypocrisy. In Moscow, there was a transit prison called Krasnaya Presnya, which in those years was nicknamed the Krasnaya Presnya Model Bathhouse. It was a showcase. When foreign delegations arrived, they were taken precisely there. Fresh paint on the walls, a library filled with volumes of Lenin, well-fed and drilled inmates. While inspectors toured the cells on the first floor, real convicts, temporarily removed from sight, were being walked around the covered exercise yard on the second floor. It was theater, a staged performance designed to prove that the world's most humane system existed in practice. In the United States of the same era, the issue of legality was approached entirely differently. There was no telephone law, where a person's fate was decided by a call from the party's regional committee. Here, judicial precedent and the famous plea bargaining held sway. Even then, the majority of sentences were handed down not by a jury, but as a result of negotiations between the prosecutor and the defense attorney. An American prison of the 60s was a rigid hierarchy of racial gangs, a world of violence and strict isolation. Yet, at the same time, an inmate had a chance to file an appeal, demand a lawyer, or turn to the press. The state, especially in the early 60s, tried to maintain the appearance of following the rules. The paradox. In the authoritarian USSR, a person could be imprisoned for a joke without a real trial. The special counsel was abolished, but the practices remained. While in the democratic USA, a black person or a poor person often became the victim of an unjust sentence due to the lack of funds for an expensive lawyer. In the USSR, the trial was a ritual spectacle. In the USA, the trial became an assembly line, where the truth was not always sought. Cases were simply closed. Part 4. Daily Life. Tea with Chafir versus Banana Riots. Let's descend from the heavens of jurisprudence to the earth of prison daily life. How did an inmate live in the USSR in the 60s and 70s? The Soviet Zek existed in a world of strict regulation. Lights out, reveille, work at the Promka, the colony's industrial zone. Many colonies had their own production facilities. They sewed mittens, assembled boxes, and made that very telogreka, quilted jacket, that became a symbol of the era. In the evenings, to keep warm and escape reality, they brewed chafir, a super-strong tea that hit the head and dulled the feeling of hunger. Here, it was not just a drug, but a means of communication. To offer someone a chafir nut, a hit of chafir, meant to show respect. The thieves' hierarchy, the ponyatiya concepts, the ban on working for the administration, this was a state within a state. The authority of the smotriachchi, overseer, was often higher than that of the colony's warden. While in an American prison, people rioted demanding better conditions, in the Soviet zone, protests were rare, but disobedience took the form of mass self-harm. People would cut their veins or sew their mouths shut to draw Moscow's attention to the lawlessness in a particular colony. In the USA, daily life was physically more satisfying, but psychologically harsher. The Gulag-style collectivism was absent here. Here there was racial segregation. Blacks, whites, and Latinos kept strictly separate. Sitting on the wrong bench in the cafeteria could cost you your life. In 1971, the uprising at Attica Prison, New York State, made headlines. Inmates seized part of the prison and took hostages. Their demands were simple as the world: better sanitary conditions, showers more often than once a week, more than one roll of toilet paper a month, and an end to the beatings by guards nicknamed goon squads. Governor Rockefeller's response was terrible. An assault, 43 killed. This event split America and showed that a prison is a powder keg. Interestingly, at the same time in the USSR, inmates were living in perhaps dirtier barrack-type conditions, with a slop bucket by the exit, but they had the illusion of a common cause, of work, of movement. In the USA, a suspended isolation reigned, where a person could be locked in a concrete cage for 23 hours a day without any activity. This was the beginning of the supermax isolation technology, which the USSR simply didn't know how to build or didn't see the need for, preferring cheap shkonar, bunk-based communal systems. Part 5. Exodus. Letters to Freedom and the Two Shores of Liberty. What awaited a person there, beyond the gates? In the USSR, a released individual encountered a system that not only did not forgive, but finished them off. Defeat in rights meant a ban on living in major cities. Not allowed in Moscow, not allowed in Leningrad, not allowed in Kiev. The so-called minusniks were sent to the hinterlands, to chemical plants where labor was scarce. No one wanted to hire an ex-convict with a wolf ticket in their passport. Although formally there was no stamp, the Human Resources Department always knew. It was an eternal brand. The institution of administrative supervision tied a person to their place of residence, forcing them to check in regularly with the police. In the United States, reintegration was formally freer. You are free to go wherever you want. But the reality was bitter. A person released from prison, especially a black man from the ghetto, entered a world where there was no work for him. The Civil Rights Act was only passed in 1964, and its implementation moved at a snail's pace. Often, the only social ladder remained the very same gang that had led him behind bars in the first place. In the USSR, a former political prisoner was often awaited by a dissident safehouse, kitchen conversations, and handwritten samizdat. In the United States, a former criminal was awaited by the unemployment line and a welfare check. But in both places, society rejected those who had done time. The shadow of the prison fell upon a person, lasting for decades. Part 6. Epilogue. A sharp turn of history. The second half of the 1970s put everything in its place. Khrushchev's liberalization reforms were forgotten. Brezhnev's USSR was once again tightening the screws. The era of treating dissent with punitive psychiatry began. A person could be placed in a special psychiatric hospital for the same beliefs, only now they were not shot, but injected with sulfazine, turning them into a vegetable. The prison system became militarized, yet remained deeply impoverished and corrupt. The USSR stopped reducing the number of camps. Their numbers stabilized, only to explode 15 years later with a new wave of Gorbachev's amnesty and the ensuing criminal chaos of the 90s. At this very same moment, a tectonic shift was taking place in the United States. From 1973 onwards, the golden age of American penology came to an end. Rising street crime, the heroin epidemic, and ordinary citizens weary of disorder demanded order. Politicians found the perfect enemy: drugs and crime. Nixon declared war, and Reagan turned it into an industry. Hundreds of private prisons were built. A three-strikes system was introduced. A third offense, even stealing a pizza, and you get life without the possibility of parole. If in the early 70s there were around 300,000 inmates in the U.S., by our time, that figure has exceeded 2 million. America has become the country with the largest prison population in the history of human civilization. The Soviet Union tried to rid itself of the legacy of the Gulag archipelago, understanding that prisoner labor was a dead end. America, on the contrary, created a new economy, the economy of incarceration, turning punishment into a profitable business. Two paths of isolation. One, a legacy of terror and hypocrisy that led a country to paralysis. The second, a path of democracy that turned freedom into a commodity and the cell into profit. The history of prisons in the 1960s and 70s showed us that neither ideology nor economic system guarantees humanity. Because, ultimately, the treatment of the criminal is always a test of the maturity of society itself.
I hope this video was helpful to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. There's a lot more interesting content ahead. See you soon.